We're down here at the Thomas Owens Ferry site. It was also the Deer Creek site. Right now we have two beautiful bridges over the top of us. This is such an important site. It was the site of the Deer Creek Ferry, then changed to Thomas Owens Ferry, and now it still creates commerce back and forth across this river. The Oak Street Bridge is to our left as we speak. Has a beautiful multi-purpose path down the south side of it that has two great viewing platforms that pop out over the water so visitors can stop and look at the water and get an idea of just what Roseburg has. Behind us is somewhere around a 6 to 10 acre body of water. It depends on what time of year you're looking at it. Of course, in the wintertime we have probably 8 to 10 acres. In the summertime, we go down to as little as 6 acres of waterfront to utilize. We hope, well, we'll get there, to have paddle boats, canoes, rowboats, all of those kind of fun things. People like to get out on the water and relax. This area was used for that years and years ago, probably 100 years ago or more, that this area was used for exactly that. People would come out in the afternoons, they would come out on the weekends, and they would rowboat, and they would have fun out here on the river. And I think it's an important thing that we get back to those kind of things where we're relaxing and enjoying the waterfront. This specific piece of property, though, has become a favorite of mine over the last few years. We first got involved with it when we were involved with Elk Island in 2009. And the city said we couldn't do anything with Elk Island because the island did not connect to these bridges for fire, life, and safety and other things. And so we studied out to find out who owned these properties right here, the bridge properties that we call them, and it was LTM Knife River. Knife River agreed to sell these properties to us because they liked what we were doing on the waterfront. So now the first time we picked these properties up, what we wanted was just the connection to Elk Island. But then as we're studying more into the properties, we found so much more. And other than the relaxation, other than being on the river, it also had history to it. And that history started with a man named Thomas Owens. Today we're going to talk about the Thomas Owens Ferry. This piece of property right here was the Thomas Owens Ferry, and originally it was the Deer Creek Settlement Ferry. Mr. Owens, to speak about him for a minute, his wife's name was Sarah. Thomas and Sarah Owens came to Oregon in the 1843 wagon train. That wagon train was the first one coming into Oregon, and it also had Jesse Applegate on it, which a lot of people have heard his name. They have not heard Thomas Owens very much. But Thomas Owens, being an 1843 immigrant, when I looked up information on him, I found out that it says that he actually was one of the first four men to bring his family into Oregon in a wagon. And when you think of the significance of that Thomas Owens ended up right here where I'm sitting today, and he chose this area to stay. This became his land patent. A lot of the old land patents, donation land claims, they're also called, they're just rectangular and they're square. Mr. Owens was such an intelligent person that he went along and he picked lots of waterfront. And because you can only get 320 or 640 acres, he picked all of these waterfront pieces out. And so it's said that he owned from here, the beginning of Elk Island, all the way down to where Douglas County Fairgrounds is today, and that he actually owned on both sides of the river. But Mr. Owens, when he first came to Oregon, he didn't come straight to Deer Creek Settlement, now called Roseburg, but he went to Astoria first, and he followed a friend of his named William Perry that had been there since 1842. He came to Oregon first, and Mr. Perry had made a grist mill. We've talked about that before, the water paddle wheel to create power to mill. He made one first for Dr. McLaughlin up in Oregon City, and then next he went to Astoria and he built one there on the creek. And then when he did that, he came down to Deer Creek, he built one here. But Thomas Owens, he helped in Astoria, as you study his history, he helped start the school system in Astoria. And he also was like the first sheriff or deputy, the elected official of Astoria. One of the other things he did was when gold was struck in California, he was intelligent enough that he created a way of building a ship so they could transport timber down to California. But then when he did all of those things in that first 7 years of being in Oregon, he then came down to this spot we're sitting at today, around 1850. And in 1850, what he did when he came to this spot and he saw this river, and Deer Creek Settlement was on the other side, he created this all as his land patent, his donation land claim, and he created a ferry across this river to connect the people on this west side of the river to the people on the east side, being Deer Creek Settlement. So he created this way of commerce so people from the west side, being his cattle industry and the other people's farming industry, could get to the Deer Creek Settlement side. So Mr. Owens, when he got to Oregon, was a very significant person, and he was a significant and is a significant person in the history of Deer Creek Settlement and in Roseburg. His family, he came from a lot of well-to-do people. His generation, probably 4 generations back from him, was Sir Thomas Owens of Europe. And then he moved to Virginia, and then the next generation moved to Kentucky. And then Mr. Owens, Thomas and Sarah, after a lot of Native American warfare they moved here to Oregon, which again, he started this ferry. So now Mr. Owens and Sarah, when they started this ferry, they called it Deer Creek Ferry. And the reason it was called Deer Creek to begin with, again, is because Roseburg in the beginning was called Deer Creek Settlement. Such a cool name, named after the creek over on the other part of the waterfront. Now, Mr. Owens, he comes in and he starts this ferry in 1850 to 1852. He had, not only did he have great ancestors before him, his daughter was Bethany Owens Adair, who also became a licensed doctor in Oregon and Washington, a female doctor, and maybe the first in the state of Oregon and Washington. And so this family not only was significant in this piece of property in the ferry, but their family did some great things. Thomas and Sarah, who owned this ferry and ran it from 1850 to probably 1884, they had their daughter, Bethany Owens Adair, and then their son, W.F. He created a sheep industry where he actually started selling sheep futures and bringing sheep into the area to supplement the cattle industry that was already here that his dad was big in. His dad owned the Mount Nebo area. It was also part of the land claim. And so a lot of his cattle raised in those areas. But back to the Owens Ferry portion, we've been cleaning this area off to be able to get people excited about the waterfront again and cause people to understand the history of this special piece of property. If we don't know, we're not going to be able to come down here and make these things happen. And so this video, we want people to understand how historically significant this piece of property is. The trail came in when the water was high, right behind us. The wagon trail went into the upper part when the water was high and the ferry would go across the river. Then as you go north of the Washington Street Bridge, then there's another trail that goes back to the river when the water was down to probably 6 acres to 8 acres. And then when the water was at the lowest, probably only about 120 feet wide or so, was when they crossed down right at the point of Elk Island. And there's another wagon trail that goes back to there. There are these deep ruts that's cut into this river bottom soil. And all of this was just discovered as we started taking the blackberries off several years ago. When we first got involved with this piece in 2012, you could not walk out here. Big corporations owned it and they didn't want anybody down here. Since we've got it, we've cleared it off. This is our second time now, and we've tried to get it sparked where people would get their interest and start coming to the riverfront. We hope this time that those things will happen and we'll get people down here to be able to rent boats, rent kayaks, get out on the water and do a lot of relaxation, do recreational sports, all of those kind of things. Now back to Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens had actually got sick as he got older in life. His son WF took over the cattle business. His son WF took over the sheep business. WF wanted to bring the businessmen of Roseburg into a new climate, and so he actually started a Roseburg Farmers Co-op and Cattlemen's Co-op. And they started selling sheep futures, and he also ran this ferry. Now, when he got involved with all of these other things, there was some issues with the futures of sheep, and people thought he had defrauded them, and so his dad had already passed on. His sister had already been ran out of town, actually, Bethania Owens Adair as a doctor, because from what I understand, she had performed an autopsy on a male, and so she was not allowed to stay in Roseburg. So she left. But all of these sad things were going on. W.F. Owens then was thought to have defrauded people with sheep futures, and Mr. Owens, the son, killed himself across the river, and a sad ending, because then just a few years later he was exonerated, and it was found out that he had not defrauded anybody and he had actually spent money of his own goods, but by then the Owens had lost everything they had. Bethania had moved on. She had become a famous doctor, female doctor. Diana, I think, had died already. She had been the first lady of Astoria. All of this history is right here in this piece of property that we're sitting on today. So the history of the ferry then, to go back, we've talked about the family a lot, but the ferry itself was actually going in place from 1850 through the 1880s. 30 some years, this family created commerce back and forth from this side of the river all the way to Deer Creek. Some of the stories that you'll read is that a famous high wire walker came to town one day and he walked a wire across Jackson Street as a precursor to him getting ready to walk the ferry cable 600 feet across the river behind us. That was an incredible thing that happened at this ferry time. Another time was in one of the great floods that came on, because there's been several in the 1800s. But the 1861 flood came through and actually cut the channel on the west side of Elk Island and created the overflow channel, which made that an island. So again, that's another historic event down here on the Great Ark Flood of 1861. But then a few years later, there was another great flood, and the Coos Bay stage used to come in here, and it would go down this little trail and get on this ferry and go across to Deer Creek or Roseburg later. And that Coos Bay stage, on one of the great floods, the cable came loose on the ferry. And so Mr. Owens had to help hold that ferry together and get it into the other side. And so that's another incredible story about what happened in those days. But it's all forgotten, and it was all covered with weeds, and it was all covered with blackberries. We've done, I believe, a good job of clearing this off, this section off. One of the things that really stands out to me is when I read the historic documents is that a man that came in that first 1843 wagon train, and he was given credit for being one of the first 4 to bring his family into Oregon in a wagon. He came to this site to raise his family. And so we hope to give back, to clean this up, and to get people onto the waterfront here in this area where the Thomas Owens Ferry took people back and forth across this waterfront from around 1850 all the way to the mid-1880s. So stay with us. We'll keep cleaning, we'll keep building, and we'll see what we can do about getting people onto this waterfront this year.